Hello everyone. In this, we will understand about experimentation in research. Before we go into experimentation, we need to understand extraneous factors means what. These are also called as extraneous variables and which can affect the outcome of an experiment along with the independent variables. So these factors are not of primary interest to the researcher, but may affect the dependent variables if they are not controlled for properly. They can threaten the internal validity, which means you can't confidently say that the independent variable causes the dependent variable. That confidence will be under threat if these extraneous factors are not controlled properly. So they can threaten the internal validity of an experiment by confounding the results and making it difficult to draw accurate conclusions about the relationship between the independent variables and dependent variables. Some common types of extraneous factors. First one, confounding variables, participant characteristics, environmental variables, researcher bias, demand characteristics. So first, confounding variables. What are these variables? These are variables that vary systematically with the independent variables and can influence the dependent variables. They can lead to erroneous conclusions about causal relationships if they are not controlled for. An example, in a study about examining the effects of a new teaching method on student performance, the teacher's enthusiasm or experience level could be a confounding variable if it varies systematically with the teaching method and affects student performance. See here, teaching method is considered to be the independent variable and the student's performance is expected to be the dependent variable. So if this teacher's enthusiasm and experience level, if it varies along with the independent variable, that is the teaching method, then that becomes a confounding variables. It will have an effect on the outcome also. Participant characteristics. Individual differences among the participants such as age, gender, personality traits, mental abilities, and prior experiences or prior knowledge can act as extraneous factors in an experiment. These characteristics may influence participants' responses to the experimental manipulation and need to be considered or controlled for us to ensure the validity of the results. Environmental variables means about the surrounding conditions. Factors related to the experimental environment such as lighting, temperature, noise level, time of the day can impact participants' behavior and responses in an experiment. Changes in these environmental variables over the course of study or differences between the experimental conditions can introduce variability and affect the results. That is why this is also an important thing to control. Researcher bias. The attitudes, expectations, and behaviors of the researcher conducting the experiment can influence participants' behavior or the interpretation of results. Researcher bias can manifest in subtle ways such as unintentional cues or differential treatment of participants across conditions can bias the findings if not controlled for. Demand characteristics. These are cues or expectations within the experimental setting that may lead participants to guess the purpose of the study or alter their behavior to conform to perceived expectations. For example, the participants may understand, they may get some hint that the researcher expects so and so as the result. So accordingly, they may alter their behavior or alter their opinions according to that. That becomes a demand characteristics because they think that the researcher expects or demands the same results from the participants. Demand characteristic can influence participants' responses and introduce bias into the results if participants modify their behavior in response to these cues. Now comes the actual topic, which is experimentation in research. It involves systematically manipulating one or more variables. Those variables are the independent variables, to observe the effect on other variable, which is our dependent variable, while controlling all the extraneous factors. That is what we saw, what are extraneous factors. It is a fundamental method used in scientific inquiry to establish cause and effect relationships between variables. The primary purpose of experimentation is to test hypotheses and establish causal relationship between variables. What are the key components of experimentation? We have independent variable IV, the variable that is manipulated or changed by the researcher. Dependent variable, the variable that is measured or observed to determine the effect of the independent variable. For example, dependent variable can be the demand of a particular commodity, and independent variable may be the price. So manipulating the price, you see whether it has got any effect on the quantity demanded or not. Control group, a group that is not exposed to the experimental treatment or manipulation used as a baseline for comparison. Means, for example, if somebody wants to test the effect of a drug which is manufactured by a pharmaceutical company to reduce pain, so they create two different groups. One is experimental group and one is control group. In experimental group, the actual drug is being given, whereas in control group, they don't give the actual drug. Instead, they give a placebo, which will be very, very similar in look-wise, shape-wise, color-wise, everything as per the actual drug. So that group, we call it as a control group, where the group is not exposed to the experimental treatment, means that group people will not be given the drug. So, and then this control group will be compared with the experimental group. Next is our experimental group, a group that is exposed to the treatment or manipulation. Randomization, the process of randomly assigning participants to different experimental conditions to minimize bias and ensure that the groups are comparable. Even 100 participants or 100 patients are there, they will be randomly assigned to the experimental group and control group equally. More or less equally, both the groups, so that the groups can be comparable. Controlled conditions. Experimentation often takes place in controlled environments to minimize the influence of extraneous variables and increase the internal validity of the study. Experimental designs. Overall, we have three different types of designs. One is between subjects design. Participants are randomly assigned to different groups, with each group experiencing a different level of the independent variable. Then within subjects design, participants are exposed to all levels of the independent variable and their responses are compared across conditions. Third is the factorial design, which involves the manipulation of two or more independent variables to examine their individual and combined effects on the dependent variable. Let us understand these three designs with some example. First, between subjects design. Suppose a researcher is interested in comparing the effectiveness of three different memory improvement techniques. So they have three methods, method A, B, and C. In this design, what happens is different groups of participants are assigned to each memory improvement technique randomly again, and their performance is compared. Each group experiences only one technique. Then in between subjects design, group 1 will be assigned method A, group 2 will be assigned method B, group 3 will be assigned method C. After training, each group completes a memory test and their scores are compared to determine which method is most effective. So that is our between subjects design. Example for within subjects design. In this design, each participant experiences all three memory improvement techniques and their performance is compared across techniques. Participants are first assessed on their baseline memory performance, means before giving the training on the methods, different methods, they initially what was their memory performance, that will be assessed. That will become the baseline. Then participants gets the training in method A, method B, and method C with the order of techniques counterbalanced across participants, means shuffling the methods among the participants, right? After completing the training in all three different techniques, participants are reassessed on their memory performance. By comparing each participant's memory performance across the three techniques, the researcher can determine which method leads to the greatest improvement in memory. Factorial design example. In this, the researcher examines the effects of two or more independent variables, those you call it as factors, on the dependent variable. Each factor may have multiple levels. Here, the researcher decides to explore not only the different memory improvement techniques, but also the impact of study environment, whether it is a noisy environment or a quiet environment, on memory performance. So here, participants are randomly assigned to one of the two study environments. So factor A is environment and factor B is technique, and receive training in one of the three memory improvement techniques. So group 1 will be given method A training in quiet environment. Group 2 will be given method A training, but in noisy environment. Group 3, method B training, quiet environment. Group 4 will be given method B training in a noisy environment. Group 5 will be given method C training in a quiet environment. Group 6 will be given method C training in a noisy environment. Then after this training, participants' memory performance is assessed and the researcher analyzes the effects of both study environment and memory improvement technique on memory performance. That is the example for factorial design. Then how do we proceed with the process of the experimentation? Researchers first develop a hypothesis, assuming certain relationship between independent and dependent variables. Then he may design the experimental procedure, including the manipulation of the independent variable, selection of participants, and measurement of the dependent variable. All these things are designed or decided in advance. Then data is collected through either observation or measurement or methods appropriate to the research question and design. Statistical analysis is conducted to determine whether there is a significant difference between the experimental and control groups or conditions. That is being done. A proper test of hypothesis is being done, and then finally you come to a conclusion whether to accept your null hypothesis or reject your null hypothesis. Researchers interpret the results considering the hypothesis and draw conclusions regarding the causal relationship between the variables. This is how the process is being done for an experimentation.